Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining today. The presentation will begin in just about 7 minutes. In the meantime, feel free to say hello and introduce yourselves in the chat. Good morning, everyone. We'll be getting started in just about 4 minutes. In the meantime, feel free to say hello in the chat box. Thank you all for joining today. Okay, hello everyone, welcome. It is right on the hour and we already have over 200 participants on the call, so we should get started. My name is Anders and I'm a member of the Global Marketing team at National Geographic Learning. Thank you for joining our first webinar of the new season, Bridging the Gap, Creating Community and Supporting Students in Any Classroom, presented by Carmella Lieske. Before I introduce Carmella, I'd like to take just one moment to go over some of the functionality of the webinar platform. First off, at the bottom of your screen, you'll notice that there are several different icons. The first button on the left is the chat function. Please use this to type in any responses to questions that Carmella asks during the session. And be sure to send your message to all panelists and attendees to make sure that the whole group can read your message. On the right, you'll see a Q&A button. Please use this to ask the presenters or hosts any questions you might have. We will do our best to answer questions as they come in, but there will also be an opportunity at the end of the session to ask questions, and you can use that Q&A box at that time as well. Finally, we will be sending along a recording of the session, a PDF of the slides, and a certificate of attendance within 5 business days of today's webinar. So without further ado, let me introduce today's speaker. Carmella Lieske is the Assistant Director in charge of Globalization and a professor in the Center of Foreign Language Education at Shimane University in Japan. She has been teaching ELT in Asia for over 20 years, empowering learners from 4 to 70+ years of age. Carmella developed the English Expert Minor and Global Leadership Minors, creating new courses such as Global Literacy, Global Interaction, Global Understanding, and Global Leadership. Carmella has worked with various international publishers, writing students' books, teachers' books, workbooks, and worksheets, as well as test packages. A few of the National Geographic learning series that she has worked on are Our World, Impact, Time Zones, and Reading Adventures. So without further ado, welcome, Carmella.
Thank you, Anders. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and I hope that you're having a good day, or you're having a good start to the day, or a good finish to the day. I'm so excited to be here and to be able to talk about supporting students and building community. But before I really get started, I have a question for you, and I'd like you to answer it in the chat box. I'd like to know if in the last 6 months you've shifted to online. If at any time in the last 6 months you've taught from online, please say yes. And if you've been able to stay in the classroom, please say no. I know there are teachers in Asia who have been able to stay in the classroom, but I can see the yeses coming very quickly. Lots and lots of people have had to shift online, so it's not surprising. My next question for you is, as you've shifted to online, have you found that you have to go a little bit more slowly and support students by explaining things a little bit more, maybe giving a little more detail, just sort of taking your time more than you would in the classroom? Has anybody experienced that? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, yes, definitely. So I can see that your experiences and my experiences are very similar. And that's exciting. I'm going to be talking about how to support students. But when I see so many people saying, yes, it's slower on internet and teaching online, it's not surprising when we see a quote like this from an assistant professor saying, when we switch to the virtual setting, we have to support students even more. And we all know that in the classroom, we have to support students as well. But when we shift to virtual, as everybody has just said, one of the things we have to do to support the students is make sure that things are clear, and it takes a little bit more time. So today I'm going to be talking about supporting students and creating community, and I have 5 strategies. Each strategy is basically possible in both the online setting and in the classroom, but there are a few places where it's unique to the online setting, and I'll be explaining that. Before I talk about the first strategy, though, I would like to tell you about the classes that I've been teaching this semester. I think that's helpful in giving you some understanding of where the information I'm talking about comes from, so that you can apply this to your classroom, because I understand that we're all in different situations, the number of learners we have, the number of languages we have. but we all share a common goal of trying to set our students up for successful learning. And one of the reasons we need to do that is because we are great teachers, honestly. Let's just be honest, we're all great teachers. So my situation is different than many teachers because when in March, many people were shifting to online, I actually was between school years. And that allowed me to have a little bit more time to prepare than many of you who I know had to make such a sudden shift. It also meant that when the students and I finally started classes, that everyone had the expectation that this was not a temporary fix. This was a semester of being online. That was good because the students understood that they couldn't just skip out on classes for a couple of weeks and hope to go back to face-to-face. But it was also bad because they were extra anxious. My students had never been online, they'd never used Zoom, they'd never used Teams, they'd never used any of these things. So I want to talk about decreasing anxiety, both in the classroom and when we're shifting to online. I imagine that many of you are just like me, and before class ever starts, we give students information. Maybe we give them a video introducing ourselves. When I shifted to online, I also gave my students more information that I wouldn't have normally given them, like how to get into Zoom. Usually we can assume that the students will get to the classroom, but when we're in Zoom, they have to know how to get to Zoom, because if they get lost digitally, we'll never find them. It's not like they're walking around a campus. So I made some handouts and I explained what Zoom was and how to get into Zoom. And I included lots of screenshots with very basic ideas and functions. And in the first class, after they actually got into Zoom, I went through those functions because I wanted to lay a solid foundation to make sure that the students could use Zoom. Again, I wanted them to fully participate in my class, and I wanted my class to be as interactive as possible. So I wanted to make sure that the students could raise their hand, send me a chat, send a private chat, be able to go to the breakout room and come back, not be lost in the breakout room, be able to put a sticker on the interactive whiteboard. It took a little bit of time, but we went through and we made sure that we did all those things. When I sent the information about Zoom, I also sent students handouts about the learning management system and Flipgrid. If you're not familiar with the term learning management system, it's a system where we can assign homework and then we'll see as the students do it, and we can see the progress, we can give them a grade, we can give them comments. So my ELT would be one of them, Blackboard, Edmodo, there are all kinds of LMSs. Teams is one, Google Classrooms. Those are all LMSs. Those are ways of getting information to our students, getting assignments to and from our students. So in the classroom, if I was in a physical classroom, I would have projected onto the screen the LMS through my computer and explained it to them. So in Zoom, I did the same thing, sharing my screen, made sure that they understood how to get into that LMS and do their assignments. Again, wanting to make sure that they could fully participate. I also opened up Flipgrid and explained Flipgrid. I want to spend just a second explaining Flipgrid in case you aren't familiar with it. Flipgrid is an app that allows students to make a video and upload it in the same app. And then they can watch each other's videos and they can make videos to reply. As a teacher, I can watch the videos and I can make a video reply, I can make a written reply, I can write a reply that actually goes out as an email. I'm not trying to sell Flipgrid. I'm just mentioning this because the word Flipgrid is going to come out in this presentation a few times. The students had never used Flipgrid, but the reason I changed to Flipgrid from the previous semester was because I was asking them before to do videos and upload them to the LMS. But students were always getting frustrated. The font or the kind of video wasn't working, or it was too big, or they just can't get it uploaded. And so I wanted them to continue to be able to make videos and interact that way outside of class, but without that frustration. I didn't like it that students were already frustrated, but especially when we're going online, we need to decrease their anxiety. We need to decrease every technological barrier that we could. At the end of that first class, after I had explained these things, we'd gone over what was going to happen, we looked at the textbook, and we had introductions and the other things that we normally do in a first class. I asked students to finish a short questionnaire to get some feedback from them. And at the end, there was an open-ended question where they could write anything they wanted. And it was exciting to see that students' anxiety was decreasing, that they were realizing that I cared about them. That's the first step in creating community, is helping the students understand that I care about them. They're not just a number to me, that they're actually a person. And I was excited that students were making comments like, oh, Zoom isn't so hard, maybe I can do this. Whether we're in the classroom or we're teaching virtually, making sure that students feel comfortable with what's going on is a huge first step. And I think that's something we would all agree with, and we all have that goal. So I want to go on now to the second strategy, which is communication. Of course, in the classroom, we have to communicate with students all the time, but when we go virtual, it becomes even more important. This is a quote from an American high school student in the New York Times, and she's talking about the communication between the teacher and the student and how essential that communication is, because otherwise students can't figure out what to do. Does this match anybody's experience? If it does, feel free to say, yeah, that's kind of my experience. It's a little bit my experience as well, that students need some help. I can see people saying totally, yes, yes. Students need help. It's kind of surprising because we think of them as digital natives, and yet they need us to go slowly and support them and be patient and be kind and be flexible and help them understand this is the LMS, this is what we're going to do. And sometimes even every week, like opening it up, sharing it on the screen and saying, okay, this is where we're at, keep track. When we're face-to-face, we would probably do that as well. We would probably be writing things on the board. This is what we're doing this week, or this is the homework for next week. So it kind of actually makes some sense. But mentioning the feedback form after the first class, I realized that when I was online, I was going to need to get a lot more feedback than I usually do. And Anders is going to bring in a poll, and I'm going to ask you to tell me what kind of feedback you usually get from your students. So you can see that I've got several different kinds. Before the pandemic, I tended to get a lot of reflections on content. Things like, connect this idea with last week's idea, or personalize something that happened, or use some critical thinking and tell me what would be the next step in this idea. We're talking about plastic and it needs to be recycled. So what would you do? But what I realized was that I needed to also focus more than I normally did on things like students' mental health. So Anders, could you close the poll and let's see the results? Yeah, I can see a lot of people are talking about reflections on content and maybe a little bit less insight into emotional health. As I went through the semester and I was getting feedback from students, I was getting all of these, and I found it to be really helpful. And so I'm going to be sprinkling that into the discussion, including right now, because it's part of communication. The students always reacted very positively when I did something. I asked them something in the feedback form, and then I reacted. So for example, you can see this bottom question where I asked students about the Flipgrid homework. And at the beginning of the semester, I programmed everything into Flipgrid and into the LMS, but I scheduled it so that it would appear little by little. We don't want to overwhelm students. We don't want them to open up the LMS and see 35 assignments, which is what they had. So I programmed it so it would appear 1 week ahead of time. But after a couple weeks of chatting with students, I realized some students were starting to get the hang of everything. They were feeling comfortable with the technology, and some students were getting stressed. So on this feedback form, I asked students, do you want to see this homework earlier? If this is going to stress you out, I don't want to do it. But if this is going to decrease your anxiety, I definitely want to do it. 75% of the students said, yes, we'd like to see it. So the next week in class, I opened up Flipgrid while sharing my screen, and I was very explicit about saying, okay, now you can see there are 2 assignments, not 1, but it's not because you have more work, it's that I'm showing you them ahead of time. One thing that I realized is even more so when we're online, we need to make sure that things are very clearly labeled. I think this is something we would want to do even if we were in the classroom, but week 1 due May 15th, so that students don't even have to open it up, that when they look at it and they see 2 or 3 different assignments, if they're not interested, they don't have to open it up. Another thing that I realized in talking to students is that I needed to confirm a little bit more whether or not they were okay with everything we'd been studying. So I had questions like the top one: are you okay with your grades? Do you have any questions? But I also asked students about halfway to 2/3 of the way through the semester, what are some of the disadvantages of studying online? I was interested in this perspective because this is a lot of their mental and emotional health, right? And so I was a little surprised by the fact that about 75% talked about connectivity issues. I was surprised simply because until this point, every week I'd been asking students, did you have problems with technology preparing for class? And if you did, what were the problems? Did you have problems in class with technology? And if you did, what were the problems? And I was asking this week after week. At the beginning, of course, lots of students had problems. I tried to help them as much as I could. But at the end, by the time we were at this point, they weren't having that many questions. They weren't having that many problems. And yet there was this undercurrent. These results showed me there was an undercurrent of stress. I think actually as teachers, we can relate to this, that we all worry, could our computer suddenly stop working? Could my electricity go out and I won't be able to give my Zoom class? When the students are in a physical classroom, once they get there, they're fine. They know that they can study. They don't have to worry about suddenly losing electricity, because if they lose it, everybody else loses it. But when we're on an online setting, the chance of students having stress about technology that's out of their control for the most part anyway is much higher. So it's helpful to remember this and remember that students are maybe a little more vulnerable, that they're a little more anxious. So again, to just be more sensitive to their needs and to be a little more accommodating in terms of giving them some, like, well, I don't know what I want to say, but just giving them some benefit of the doubt, I guess, in terms of, like, if you ask a student a question and they don't answer immediately, in the classroom, we can see what's going on with that student. They're not paying attention and it's very obvious. But when we're on Zoom, it's not quite as obvious. So giving them the benefit of the doubt and saying, maybe it's a computer problem, rather than thinking, oh, that student's not paying attention again, because it really could be a computer problem. And giving them the benefit of the doubt is something that I think is really important when we're shifting to online. So I want to go on now to the third point, which is communicating and building community during class. And I actually have 3 points here because I think building community is something that's so important in our classroom. And I think it's something we want to do, whether we're in the classroom or we're online. So the first is your time after you open your breakout room, or you open your Teams, or you open Google Classroom, but before you start teaching. So in my case, it's 10 or 12 minutes. What do you do for that 10 or 12 minutes? I've heard so many different ideas, but I think that 10 or 12 minutes is really valuable. So as people are sharing ideas, I also want to give you a few of the ideas I've heard. Some teachers are sharing their screen and they're sharing the textbook that they're going to be studying. So they're using the presentation tool, and they're either allowing students to review or to preview. And that's fantastic. That helps them not be anxious that they don't remember something from the reading or something. I know some teachers are having a music playlist, and they're just playing music so the students can just sit and relax and listen to music. I know some teachers are immediately opening up breakout rooms so that the students can go and they can chat. And that's nice too, because that's close to what happens in the physical classroom. In my case, what I decided to do was spend that 10 or 15 minutes chatting with the students. So I opened my Zoom room. Almost immediately, a student came in. I opened it 10 to 12, 15 minutes early. And in one specific class, it was the same student every single week. It was so interesting. that it was always her. So she liked to chat, and that was great. And I loved to chat with her. But one of my goals was to make sure that students felt valued. So as each student came into the Zoom room, I tried to make sure and say something to them. Hi, Sam, how are you doing? At a minimum, I tried to say hi in their name, but I tried to at least ask them how they were doing. I actually got a lot of insight into how they were doing mentally and got a little of information that I could use for the class. So for example, a student said, I'm really tired. I didn't sleep last night. I was working on a project all night. Oh, well, so I told him, like, it's 5 minutes till class starts. Why don't you go get a Coke, or why don't you go get some coffee? So he dashed off, and then he came back, and he was a little more awake. But because I knew that he'd been up all night, I also understood when he was a little bit slow to respond. Building that community during that 10 minutes was so rewarding for me. When I was in the physical classroom, I never had that opportunity because I was going into the classroom and I was setting up my computer and logging into Wi-Fi and doing all these things. And so I couldn't just spend that time talking with students. It was still the same for me, 10 or 12 minutes, but when I was online, I was able to spend that time building community with students. And I think that the students really appreciated it, because otherwise I don't think they would have coming 12 minutes early. I think they would have come a little bit later. I want to go on now to the second idea, which is called the question of the day. As I mentioned, I send an email or I send a link to Flipgrid. And in the Flipgrid, I have my introduction. So before the first class, I want students to just get into Flipgrid and watch my introduction. I don't ask them to do anything else. I don't want it to be overwhelming. I want it to be scaffolded. Between the first class and the second class, I ask them to make an introductory video and upload it. Their classmates can watch it, but I don't require them to watch it. But at the end of that video, I ask them to ask me a question, the question of the day, that I'm going to be responding to. I'm going to answer all their questions during the semester. Those questions, I went little by little through the semester and I answered them. But what was interesting for me is that this semester in particular, I think because they could watch each other's videos, I had more unique questions and fewer repeated questions. In a physical classroom, I would do the same thing, but I would ask them to write the questions down and on a little form where they're also giving me some other information. But they would tend to have more of the same kinds of questions. And I don't know 100%, but if you see the number up on the top, it says 997 views. Just those introductory videos made by 16 students were watched 997 times by those 16 students. This is a closed system, so only those 16 students and me can watch those videos. So this is another reason that I think that they were watching each other's videos to make unique questions. So they made the video and they came into the second class and I started answering the questions. And at the end of the class, I had this feedback form that I mentioned. I wanted to get information from students. I wanted to have more communication with students. And the students, over 20%, wrote in the open-ended part that they were so glad that I started answering their questions, that they were excited that they'd gotten to know me. So this is another way to decrease anxiety, to increase community, to help students feel more comfortable, that I was willing to share a little bit of my life. And I continued answering questions little by little as the semester went on. But I sometimes tried to tie it into what we were doing in class. As much as possible, I actually tried to tie it in. So students asked me things like, what is your favorite music? Oh, great, we're going to study a unit on music. I'll tie it into that unit. So before we studied the unit, I actually answered the question, but it was the middle of the semester and the students were a little tired. So I not only answered the question, but I showed them a music video that I had recently found and that I liked. And it was a kind of peppy one, and it was at the beginning of the class, and I thought, well, this will give them a little energy boost. Something I would have done in the physical classroom as well. Again, at the end of the class, I had this feedback form, and again, it was open-ended, but over 20% said, oh, they liked talking about music, not only with the other classmates, but also with me. And they liked watching the video. So I think students recognized that I was trying to build community with them, and I wanted them to also build community with each other. Sometimes I gave them the opportunity to get into a breakout room for just a minute or two and talk with each other about, after I gave my answer, about how they felt about maybe the music video. I gave them 2 minutes to talk about the music video. Did you like this? What did you think was interesting about it? It was all tying into the unit, so it was great. The third point for creating community in the classroom is breakout rooms. And we're going to have another poll now, because I'd like you to tell me how many times in a 45 or 50-minute class you usually have breakout rooms. I know that some teachers with technology, it's very difficult to have breakout rooms, because when the students move from the main room to the breakout room and back, that's where the connection is most likely to get cut, or just randomly, but specifically right there. So if you have a lot of students like that, of course, it's difficult to do breakout rooms. But I also know, as I've been talking to teachers in various countries, that many teachers kind of want to do breakout rooms, or they want to do channels in teams, or they want to do something similar in another setting, but they don't know exactly what we should do in breakout rooms. And I see 37% aren't using them. So I want to talk about breakout rooms for just a minute, because breakout rooms became sort of the bread and butter of my classroom. And so many teachers have said similar things. You can think of breakout rooms like the pair work that we do in class, like the small group work that we do in class. I see somebody said that they have a breakout room for 2 or 3 times, but only 2 minutes, but that's okay. When we have pair work, sometimes it's only 2 minutes, right? When we do this kind of conversation, it only takes 2 or 3 minutes. So the students go into the breakout room. When we're in the classroom, we walk around, we try to help them if they need help with pronunciation. When they're in breakout rooms, we can jump between the breakout rooms as well. I went back and watched some of my videos, and in an hour and a half, in a minute and a half, not an hour and a half, in a minute and a half, I can jump between 8 or 10 breakout rooms easily. So you can, yeah, I see somebody, I can't do my lesson without breakout rooms, exactly. So many people, once you start using them, you find out they're just fantastic. But if you have concerns about how much time it takes, in a minute and a half, you can jump between 8 or 10. I recommend that. I think that's important, because we sort of keep students on task. They don't know when you're coming. They don't know if you're coming twice. So they're much more likely to do the conversation. I almost never had problems with going into a breakout room and they weren't doing anything, even when they were doing something more open-ended, maybe something like this, the project or the communication task. And I think because I was going there, they knew that I was going there. And especially for the project and the communication tasks and the open-ended questions, I would try to join some of the conversations. And that was another way for them to hear my opinions and join. Just like in the physical classroom, I would join them. I want to tell you a couple of little things I learned during my semester of being online. These projects are amazing and fantastic and super fun, but sometimes we don't have time. We were just talking of 20 minutes ago about how things take a little bit longer when we're online. You could keep 1 or 2 of the projects, and you could have students work on those while you're doing a speaking test, if you have a speaking test, like as a midterm. There are so many ways to do assessment. Actually, if you start being creative with Zoom or Teams or something, lots of fun things you can do. But this is definitely something that students can be doing. The other thing I want to mention is that when you have a task like communication, the main goal is not to make a beautiful chart. A chart's nice, but the main goal is that the students go and they talk with each other, they practice giving opinions, they practice using the language, and they come back and they've made a group consensus. So a little bit of collaboration about what is the most popular music in the group. So if your students have a physical textbook, they can make this beautiful chart. That's great. But if they're using an online version of the textbook, asking them to jump back and forth between the online version and the breakout room that they're in can sometimes be a little bit tricky, again, depending on their technology, depending on their comfort level with the technology. If you have students who maybe aren't comfortable doing quite so much jumping back and forth, just ask them to jot a few notes in their notebook. If they jot the notes in their notebook, they're still accomplishing what you want them to do. They're still giving opinions. They're still talking. The other thing that I want to ask you to share in the chat box is, in a physical classroom or in a breakout room, do you have students keep the same partner for the entire class, or do you change and have maybe students change partners? My goal is always that the students get to know everybody in the classroom. So in a physical classroom, I would have A be with A be with B the first week, and A be with C the next week, and A be with D the week after that, so that they get to know each other. But I would also ask them at some point, okay, change partners, talk to the person in front of you, talk to the person behind you. And I see a lot of people saying, yeah, I change, definitely change. It's random, sometimes I change. Absolutely. Realizing that my students would never be able to meet physically, face to face, I especially wanted them to get comfortable with each other right away. So I decided that breakout rooms are fantastic. Zoom can give them new partners. So from the beginning of the semester, I changed their partners. Not every time we had a breakout room, because that would be a little excessive, but every few times. If they'd been talking about music for a little while and given some opinions, okay, give them a new partner, and then they can talk about music, but it'll be new opinions and it'll be easy. And there's always two students who haven't talked to each other. I know sometimes it's a little hard to get everybody to meet each other, but if you have breakout rooms and sometimes you have 5 students, sometimes you have 3 students, it's easier to make sure that everybody gets to meet each other at some point. So I want to just share with you what my students said about halfway through the semester. I asked them, okay, I'm giving you new partners. I mean, not every time, but not every time they have a new breakout room, but every class. Are you okay with this? And the students, 75% said they liked it. They liked meeting different partners. And in the feedback form that I've mentioned, every time I had it, which was every week, students were consistently saying things like, I had fun talking with different people. I got different ideas. One time they were in a breakout room and they said, we found out that we all had a similar experience. There were 5 people in that breakout room that time. So the students indicated that they really liked having different partners. But you can see that 22% of the students said they'd prefer to have one partner for the whole day. This is where, again, judging students' emotional status and what's going on with them, I thought, well, I can accommodate that. Sometimes I can just not change partners for the whole day, or only change partners once instead of changing partners 2 or 3 times. So by getting this kind of feedback, I was able to be a little more sensitive, especially to those 22% who maybe were more shy, more nervous. Maybe they'd been with partners who had a little bit better English. So I could accommodate that. The last thing I want to mention about breakout rooms is, in the same way that in the physical classroom, we need to make sure that students can get our attention if they need help. Make sure that you teach how students ask for help. This is one of the things that I taught that first day when I was teaching functions. I reviewed it the second week, because if they get into digital no man's land, the only way for them to get help is to leave that breakout room, come to the main room, but I'm busy jumping. Then I've got to notice what's happening, go to the main room, talk to them, and then help them, and then they can do their pair work. That wastes a lot of time. If they can just send me a little help, I need help with this function, then they'll be in much better shape. I want to go on now to the 4th strategy, which is creating community outside of class. And Anders is going to bring out one more poll. And I'd like to ask you to tell me whether or not you use interactive homework with your students. So for this, I mean things like a student makes a Flipgrid video. It doesn't have to be Flipgrid, but makes a video and the other students have to respond. Or the students write something. The poll just disappeared, but that's okay. Oh, here it comes. The students write something and then another student responds to them. Or the student writes something and somebody makes a video to respond. So this is interactive homework. That's kind of what I'm talking about. Even before, when I was face-to-face, I did that. But like I mentioned, the video was always kind of problematic. So I found Flipgrid this year. And I can see that a third of you don't, but 2/3 of you do, and that's fantastic. I just want to quickly share my results for those of you who aren't using it, so you can consider this. This is with Flipgrid. If you have students who don't have as much connectivity, then the writing idea is probably going to be a better choice than the video, because the video requires a little bit more bandwidth. And writing, they could write it in Word, and then when they do have an internet connection, they could just upload it quickly. It doesn't use nearly as much data. It doesn't need as much connection. But can I have the poll closed? Thanks. Okay, it's closed. Okay, there it goes. Thank you. So sorry. For the Flipgrid, for the face-to-face at class, the students get to see each other. But in terms of seeing each other outside of class, they're not running into each other in the hallways. They're not running into each other anywhere else. So having a opportunity for them to use some video and actually see each other, especially during lockdown, is important. But actually, we're always trying to teach our students to do more speaking, and they feel kind of awkward sitting in their house talking to themselves. So if you find a way to have video, it's a fantastic way for them to speak. So here you can see, this is for one of my classes, 16 students, 12 assignments that they had, and almost 12,000 views. That means that for each assignment, there were almost 1,000 views. But again, only 16 students. Flipgrid has so kindly calculated for me that it was 223 hours of interaction. That's 223 hours of my students speaking English, watching each other speak English, having something resembling human interaction, even though it's not live, all outside of class, talking about the content. This is also a great way if there's something that you didn't quite get done in the classroom because we're going a little bit more slowly when we're online, make it into a Flipgrid assignment and let them make it in a video and then respond to their classmate. It's a great way for them to interact. So I will definitely keep using Flipgrid even when I go back, because I want the students to have these 223 hours of interaction. The other thing is that the students' feedback was always positive. After they'd made about 4 videos, I said, how do you feel about Flipgrid? And like 75% said, it's fun. Wow, I want to give assignments that students say it's fun. About a third of the students, over 30%, said that they enjoyed watching their classmates' videos and responding. So I had very good feedback from this. And if you can do this, that's fantastic. The last thing I want to talk about is creating community by activities that are inside and outside of the classroom. So we're bringing in community that's a little bit broader. There's one last poll I'd like to ask you to complete, and it asks you whether or not you've completed a project. Of course, there are all kinds of great projects in the textbook. So the project I'm referring to is actually more like something where you take the content and the students do some brainstorming and they come up with an idea to expand the content. So this isn't a project that you would probably have every week, because you can't probably afford that much class time and you need students to be doing other assignments. But maybe something that you would assign every 6 weeks, or something that you would assign every once in a while. And I can see some people have used projects a little bit, but not so much. So I want to spend a couple minutes, first of all, having us brainstorm. If the topic is scientists for a day, our goal is to have students collect some data. Not on the internet, because the internet is so complicated. We have to worry about reliable resources and plagiarism and whether they're reading in English or they're reading in their home language. Just, they're going to go collect some data. They're going to learn how to collect data. They're going to bring it back into the classroom. They're going to talk about it with each other. Can anybody share in the chat box something that they could collect data on? It could be in their house, especially during COVID-19, or if it's something that they could be scientists for a day, but they could go outside and they could socially distance and be safe, but they could go outside. So for example, they could take a walk. Oh, that would be a nice thing. Family history, fantastic. Insects, yes. My idea was they could take a walk and in 10 minutes count how many people they meet walking a dog. Have somebody count different kinds of tree leaves. Yeah, count worms, count plant seeds, meteorology, all kinds of things we can ask students to notice. So this is kind of an activity where they're noticing, but then we ask them to bring it into the classroom and to discuss it. So they're getting to discuss things, and it's kind of a scaffolding for bigger projects. Having them think about healthy food, having them think about plants. These are all fantastic ideas. Noticing something in their neighborhood. Noticing is really a great idea. I want to go on now and talk about something that's a little bit bigger project, but it still focuses on students noticing. And this is based on noticing plastic. It's also a nice thing to do because some of our students are pretty stressed out, and some of us teachers are pretty stressed out about COVID-19. But at some point, COVID-19 will no longer be a problem. I strongly believe that. And we all hope that, right? Go back to our classroom, see our students. But this plastic problem is going to exist longer than COVID-19. We all know about the plastic that's out in the ocean. We know about the plastic that lasts 1,000 years. So we can ask students to brainstorm ideas about thinking about plastic or talking about plastic. I asked my students to brainstorm these ideas, and I see somebody said go out and pick up plastic. So we could ask them, go out, pick up plastic, and then let's classify it. Is it wrappers? Is it PET bottles? In my students' case, what we did was for 2 days, they couldn't use anything plastic as much as possible. Of course, we all know that's impossible. Is there anything you can imagine that you could not give up for 2 days, that you couldn't avoid because of you need it? It's made of plastic. In fact, there are lots of things. So what I always have my students do is take pictures. Taking pictures is easy because we don't have to worry about vocabulary. It's also easy because they always have their phone and they're very visual learners. So they can come into the classroom, or they can come into Zoom or Teams or whatever you're using, and they can flip through the pictures and they can see the pictures. So they would bring in something like this. These are just a few of the pictures of one student of things he could not give up for 2 weeks. For 2 days. Actually, when he brainstormed this project at first, he said 7 days. And I was like, yeah, that's going to be way too long. Let's make it 2 days. So we made it 2 days. You can see, think of all the things. Like, this is soap down here, especially during COVID-19, but even not during COVID-19. We are going to wash our hands. We are going to wash our clothes. We're going to wash the dishes. We're going to need soap. So when students start gathering this information and taking pictures, they realize how much plastic there is around them. So they've collected the information, and then they come back to class and they can talk about, what could I avoid? What could I not avoid? So they can also take pictures of the things that they substituted. So this kind of project is possible even with students in starter or level 1. We don't have to wait until they're in level 3 or level 4. If you look at this sentence, this utterance by one of my students, the student was a little higher level. But if the student has a picture, they can show their partner a picture of some chopsticks and say, I can't use this. Show a picture of a spoon and a fork. I can use this. Can is one of the first things that students learn, right? If they're a little bit more advanced, I used this. I didn't use this. So if they know past tense. If they know want, I want to use this, a picture of disposable chopsticks, which they can't use because they're wrapped in plastic. So even if they're lower level English speakers, that doesn't mean we can't start making them aware of sustainable development goals and problems that exist around the world, problems that are much bigger than them. 1 week without plastic. Take that challenge. It's gonna be difficult. For students who have a little bit more English, we can also ask them to make some conclusions. So even lower level students, we can ask them to talk about it, but to make the conclusions is going to require a little bit higher level of English. You can see one of my students said, it was stressful. No plastic, no life. That was his conclusion, no plastic, no life. In fact, when students do these kinds of projects, I try and do them as well. So I can attest to the fact that it's very difficult to avoid plastic. If you just even look at right now what we're using as we're talking, My camera, my monitor, my keyboard, my mouse, my computer, everything has plastic. So if you wanted to have a week off of technology, maybe that would be possible. But otherwise, this idea of 1 week without plastic is pretty hard. At home, no risk. Yeah, okay. I want to go on now and wrap up with some of the students' reactions, because I think this sort of brings all of the ideas together, and it's the students' voices which are the most powerful, in my opinion. The first thing I want to share with you is that about halfway through the semester, I asked the students, what are some of the advantages of studying online? They were kind of negative before that. In the middle of class, I quickly got onto my Google form as they were going into a breakout room, and I added this question because I wanted them to be a little more positive. Again, the whole thing about like being careful about students' mental health. So I wanted them to think a little more positively. And I loved some of the observations. This was all open-ended, and students' observations were fantastic. That almost 60% of them said things like, it's easy to interact. I can get lots of ideas. But also, I love this one. It's easier to raise my hand so I can use chat. Have you ever thought about some of the advantages for your students? For example, when you and I are explaining a grammar point, most students will not raise their hand in the middle of that grammar point explanation. They're too shy. They don't want to look like they're the only one that doesn't understand. They think it's rude to interrupt the teacher. So they keep that question in the back of their mind, but they might continue to get a little bit confused. But with Zoom or being online, we can have them send that question to us privately by chat. Nobody else even knows that they've asked it. We can answer the question. So they're not as confused as long. And we all know if one student has a question, other students have a question. So they've actually helped the rest of the class be less confused. It was a great observation. It was something I'd kind of noticed, but hadn't actually been able to verbalize. I just noticed that things were going kind of smoothly and that students seemed very comfortable, but I hadn't really been able to verbalize exactly how that was so helpful until the students pointed it out. The other thing that I thought was very insightful was a couple of students mentioned the fact that they could see each other's expressions. When we're in the classroom, we can see all the students, but the students can't see each other. So creating an environment where they get to see each other online is fantastic. I'm actually trying to figure out how I could arrange my desks so that they could see each other, but I have not been able to see when I go back to the physical classroom, right? How to make that happen. If you actually have an idea, please share it in the chat box, because that's the whole thing of teaching. Like, we share ideas with each other. And I can't figure out how all students can always see each other physically in a classroom. So please share the idea if you have it. The second thing I want to share is that at the end of the semester, on the end of the semester feedback, I asked the students, did you like this class because it was interactive and had lots of chances to use English? And the students were very positive. This is not because this was their first time to have an interactive class. I think this was a reflection of it was interactive in spite of being online. The reason I think this is these were mandatory classes that I'm talking about. And the students had taken another mandatory class the previous semester that was also very interactive, and that they'd also had lots of chances to use English. If they hadn't had that experience, I would think, well, it's kind of hard to discern, is this because of interactivity or because of lots of chances to use English? But because they had that, I do believe that this is a reaction to the fact that we did this even online, which is great. The last thing I want to share with you is the fact that, as I mentioned, every week I was getting feedback from the students, and consistently students were talking about the fact that they could get other students' opinions, they could share ideas through that breakout room, also through the Flipgrid, but this was mostly focusing on what happened in the classroom. So they were sharing ideas, and they really, really liked that. That's something that would have happened, I'm sure, in the physical classroom, but it was nice to see that consistently on an open-ended question, 35 to 55% of the students were mentioning it. Although it was not as many students, you can see the percents are much lower. Every week, students mention things about building relationships with each other and building relationships with me. that they liked the story I told, or they liked the story that I gave them when I went into the discussion room. Some students one time talked about, I liked it that you came in when we were practicing the dialogue and you taught me how to say uh-huh with extra facial expressions. Very natural, very easy to do. I remember that actually. It was really fun when I went into that room and they were at the end and I was able to do that. And so the students mentioning these things consistently week after week was another indication that their anxiety went down, that they felt supported, and that they were able to make community both with each other and with me, which I thought was very exciting. I want to thank you so much. It's been so nice to be here. I love all of the contents that everyone has been sharing in the chat box, and I want to thank you for doing the polls. Anders, thank you for pulling out those polls as well. I have a few minutes before we have to finish, so I want to answer some questions. I think there might be a few, and if you have something, put it in the chat box. Let me see, I've got a few questions. I really like the way you set up the feedback questions. What tech did you use? Very nice question. There are all kinds of ways to do it. My LMS had a way to, I was using Edmodo. My LMS had a way to do it, but after about 2 weeks, I changed to Google Forms actually. But there are many ways to do it. But the reason I changed to Google Forms is because I could copy and paste week after week some of the questions that kept repeating. I could just copy it in. And I liked it because it consolidated all the data for all of my mandatory classes. It would split it up. I also liked Google Forms because I could send them the link by chat. So I would send them the link by chat and I could ask more questions. Edmodo was not letting me ask very many questions, but that was just my personal preference. There are lots of other ways to do it, but I have talked to quite a few teachers who are also doing Google Forms or something like Google Forms. What you wouldn't want to do is have a Word document where students are sending you all these Word documents and you have to consolidate. That would not be a good idea. I know some teachers are doing it through interactive whiteboards at the end, or they're maybe doing it through an interactive document. So that becomes anonymous as well, right? They have the question and then you can, the students can just write in their answers. I liked that I could see which students were saying what, because if they were having problems with technology, I always sent them a private email. Exactly what kind of problems did you have? Are you using a LAN cable? Are you connected to Wi-Fi? Things like that. So I liked to see which students were saying what, but if you want it to be anonymous, you could do something like that as well. Okay, how old are the students you worked with? My students are 18, 19 years old. So, but I know teachers that are using breakout rooms all the time in junior high, senior high. In terms of age, I don't think that breakout rooms are restricted to older students. I think my nephews have talked about using breakout rooms and they're in middle school. So I think that any age is fine, but how long you leave them in there might make a little bit of a difference. Yep. Oh, can I share an icebreaker activity? So that could be a very long discussion, but I consider kind of that chatting to be an icebreaker, and definitely I consider the question of the day to be an ice break activity in a sense, because it just sort of made everyone feel comfortable. And even though I tied it into the content often, the students had fun doing that. Sometimes I allowed them to, like I said, go into the breakout room and just talk about that for a minute to share their own opinions. So when I was talking about favorite music, I let them go and talk about favorite music as well, just for a minute, because I knew we were going to be talking about it in the classroom. I hope that answers your video. Could I share some examples of my Flipgrid videos? I would love to. Unfortunately, I'm not on my computer where my Flipgrid videos are, and I would need to white out my student or blur out my students' faces and their names, and I haven't actually prepared that. So, but maybe in the future I could. That would be a very nice thing, I think. When do I start school? I'm not sure if you mean in the day, like classes start at 8:30 in the morning, or if you mean the semester. The semester started late because of the coronavirus. The school kept thinking, maybe we can go back to face-to-face, just like the rest of the world. This is going to be a 2-week thing, and then we're going to go back. So the university delayed the start of the semester. But then it became obvious that that was not going to happen. And so then they delayed it a little bit again. So my semester actually started in May this year. Usually it would start in April. In Japan, the academic year is from April to March. And I actually am just finishing my grading from the semester that ended. But at the same time, I'm just starting some intensive classes. And our new semester starts October 1st. Let me see. Let's see, somebody's asking about certificates. I'm sure you're going to get a certificate. What did you use to create the polls? That would be in my feedback forms. That would be what I talked about in terms of like Google Forms. If you're talking about the polls in Zoom, your license depends on whether or not you have polls. So not every license has a poll in Zoom, unfortunately. So that could be a problem. Somebody asked me if I differentiate my students' learning in the classroom. I'm not sure what you mean by differentiate. Is there any way that you could follow up with that question maybe, and then I could try and answer it? So for the question of the day, did I use Flipgrid? It was, so the way the question of the day worked is the students had asked me questions in their introduction, and I watched their videos and I pulled all those questions out. But the rest of the Flipgrid assignments all had to do with content that I wanted them to discuss, or ideas that I wanted them to think about a little bit more based on what we were doing in the classroom. It was always homework. Flipgrid was always homework. That's why those 223 hours were so amazing to me, because that was 223 hours that those students, 16 students, spent outside of class, interacting with each other in English, watching videos, making, and it didn't include any of the making time. It was only the watching time. So that's why I love that. That was all homework. How would your first lessons of this school year look like? What activities do you use? So I would do, honestly, I'm going to do the exact same thing that I did last semester. I'm never going to assume that my students know any of the technology. And I'm glad that you mentioned, that you asked this question so that I can mention this. I think that our students are in, some of our students are not so strong in technology, and it's good to review things, even if it's been just a couple of weeks, they may have forgotten. I think as well, when we have students who we've never had before, that we can't assume that the teacher that they had before was doing synchronous learning. They may have been doing asynchronous. And even if they were doing synchronous, they may not have been using the interactive whiteboard. They may not have been using breakout rooms. So my first class, I'm always going to make sure and go through the technology. Even if I was face-to-face, I would have spent time going through the LMS and going through Flipgrid, because if they don't have that foundation, they're going to be frustrated the rest of the semester. They really need to know how to use that. And at the end of the class on a feedback form to say, yeah, okay, I'm okay with this technology. I'm going to be okay. It's not too scary. So I'm always going to do that. But I also always try to have some kind of activity so they get to know each other, so they introduce each other, so they start to feel comfortable. I give them my expectations. If I'm in Zoom or digital, I'm going to make sure I'm giving them my digital expectations as well as my regular expectations, because we have to, I think, define for students that on top of everything else, there are some things that will not be acceptable or will be acceptable in Zoom. So I would, that's the kind of thing I would do my first class. I love that question. Thanks.
So I'm going to jump in here for some end of session housekeeping notes. But first off, thank you, Carmella, for the fantastic session.
It's my
thank
pleasure.
you again to everyone who joined today.
Absolutely.
Before you leave, a couple of things. Immediately after today's session, you'll be directed to a feedback survey, and we would love to hear your thoughts on this webinar. As a reminder, we will be sending a recording of this session as well as a certificate and the slides to the email you used to register for today's webinar. The examples used today, many of them were from Time Zone's 3rd edition. Time Zone's 3rd edition uses photography and videos from National Geographic and inspiring stories of global citizens to encourage teenage learners to explore their world in English. And if you're interested in learning more about time zones, you can visit us at eltngl.com/timezones. or you can contact your local National Geographic Learning representative at eltngl.com/repfinder. I also want to mention that we have several upcoming webinars designed to support you in any type of classroom, whether you're teaching online, face-to-face, or some combination of the two. Please join us for the webinar Transform English Language Learning Using Technology, which will be next Wednesday with Drs. Joan King Shin and Jared Borup. And you can register at the link that I am posting into the chat box right now. And be sure to join us in our online community for teachers of English through our social media channels, where we offer up-to-date information about future live and virtual events. We offer practical classroom tips, exciting real-world content, and product information as well. Thank you again for joining, and we hope to see you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.